So let's take a look at what McMahan calls the reconciliation strategy. The reconciliation strategy is to accept the existence requirement. That is, to say that death is not a bad thing for the person who dies, or that the person who dies does not suffer misfortune when they die. And that's all that it says. What it doesn't say is that continuing to live instead of dying is not a good thing. So this strategy, I think, is to say that the existence requirement is relatively innocuous, because we can reconcile a lot of our other beliefs with the existence requirement. Because on the face of it, one of the apparent implications of the existence requirement, that is, someone must exist in order for a bad thing to be said to have happened to them, one of the implications seems to be that killing is not wrong, because there's no one there who exists when you killed them to suffer the misfortune. Whereas the reconciliation strategy says, well, you can say that it is not a misfortune to die, but at the same time, you can say that it is a good fortune to continue to live. That is, that although we cannot be said to suffer misfortune when we die, that the alternative to death, that is continuing to live, is indeed a good. That it is a good thing to continue to live instead of dying, although dying cannot be said to be a bad thing. Now that, I think, is an interesting way of thinking about it, and perhaps that strategy is more in line with what I would say, being a sympathetic reader of Epicurus, of what Epicurus really meant. That is, Epicurus said pure logic demands that we say that death is not a misfortune for us. However, that does not mean that life is not good, that we cannot, that the continuation of someone's life is not a good thing for them. I think, in fact, that's what he meant, having, again, sympathy for Epicurus. So, to say that someone's death is not a misfortune for them is not to say that someone's continuing to live is not good for them. And this would allow us to reconcile the existence requirement with other beliefs that we have, which is a very important thing for McMahan. Common sense, deeply entrenched intuitive beliefs have a lot of authority for him. So as he says, that if we have an argument that seems to undermine those deeply entrenched intuitive or common sense beliefs, it better be a heck of a good argument. And if it's not a really, really good argument, we should probably preserve our common sense beliefs rather than throwing them away for the sake of an argument. So this notion is that although death is not a bad for someone, continuing to live instead of dying can be said to be a good for someone. The complication here is the introduction of the so-called comparative view. Comparative view basically says that if we say that something is good for someone, then he says the judgment that an act or event is good for someone implies that if there is no relevant alternative that would be equally good or better, then the relevant alternative or alternatives to that act must be worse for that person. And then the converse, similarly, we claim that an act or event is bad for someone implies that unless there is some relative alternative that would be as bad or worse, then any relevant alternative must be better for that person. And this brings up some complications with what we just said. Because, of course, if we say that continuing to live is good for a person, then the comparative view would force us to say that not continuing to live, that is dying, would be bad for a person. And this would mean that we have to make a choice here, basically, between our common sense beliefs that continuing to live is good for a person and the existence requirement that says that not continuing to live, that is, dying, cannot be said to be bad for the person. So what McMahan then does with the rest of this section is to say that the comparative view simply is well, not exactly wrong, because it holds in most cases, but that it is an overgeneralization from standard cases to non-standard cases. That is, that for most of the time, when we say that something is good for someone, we would mean that any alternative which is not as good for someone would be worse. And if we say that something is bad for someone, then any alternative that would be not as bad for someone would be better. But this only holds for standard cases, not for complicated cases like death, where the issue of existence comes into play. That is an important thing, I guess, but I think the important thing with the reconciliation argument is to say that, well, we can believe in the existence requirement, or we can hold the existence requirement, which does imply that someone's death cannot be said to be a bad for them, or someone has not suffered a misfortune when they die. However, that does not mean that we can't hold that to continue to exist is not a good. That is, we can believe that the alternative to dying, that is, continuing to exist, is a good for the person who continues to exist. That is, that there's no logical requirement, if we hold the existence requirement, to hold also that continuing to live is not a good. And this is an important result, really, because what it means is that the existence requirement, or the Epicurean principle that dying cannot be said to be a bad for the person, does not imply that continuing to live is not a good. And this would allow us then to believe both in the existence requirement and to hold also a lot of other common sense beliefs we have. For instance, that killing is wrong. Killing then would be wrong not because causing someone to die is wrong. Killing then would be wrong because it prevents continuing to live. That is, if continuing to live can be said to be a good, then killing someone would be depriving them of a good that they might have experienced. So there is some important result here that